Psycho by Robert Bloch is one of the most influential creative works for the horror genre of all time. Most people are far more familiar with Alfred Hitchcock's iconic 1960 film adaptation of the book, which was a major hit and broke box office records and was a massive innovator for the horror movie genre that would come later, with movies like Friday the 13th and Halloween. However, Hitchcock, despite being a renowned director, didn't write Psycho. A man named Robert Bloch had originally published Psycho a year earlier in 1959, which although didn't originally attract all that much attention, it did attract none other than Alfred Hitchcock, who adapted the book into the phenomenon that it had become within cinema. But what was Psycho before Hitchcock's film, which, obviously by being a movie and one with only a runtime of 109 minutes, left out much of the detail into the character of Norman Bates, the story's iconic madman. The original story of Norman Bates is one marked with terror and the terrible directions of fate, which brought together a cluster of events that in the end displayed the mental rot of a young man living in 1950s California, a man that spent the majority of his time in seclusion and who would entertain a variety of delusions and make us question what forces are truly at play.
Hello, my name is Noah. I like to talk about the books I read. Today we're going to be looking at Robert Bloch's Psycho.
The author Robert Bloch introduces us to Norman Bates. Norman is an odd man. For all of his life, he has always been a mama's boy. Even up until his 40s, Norman never had much for a social life, and he never married. Norman could have done something with his life. He could have went out on his own, but he felt that his obligations were to his mother and their motel, which was obscured on an old highway in Fairvale, California. Norman spent his entire life tending to the needs of the motel, never going out nor leaving his old mother behind. One day, Norman is reading up at his and his mother's house that they live in behind the motel. Norman is somewhat overweight and spends a lot of his unoccupied time reading books. He's reading a book about the Inca Empire by the time his mother disrupts him. Norman finds himself particularly interested with how the Incas would make drums out of the stomachs of dead enemies, and he was fascinated in trying to imagine what kind of sounds such an instrument would make. Soon he would hear his mother Norma yelling from upstairs to get up and tend to the motel, since it's getting late and he has yet to turn on the motel sign that would signal that they're open. "You're lucky you're not a real man, or you'd march right down there and do what needs doing instead of whining here like a schoolgirl," said Norman's mother. Norman is hesitant, and has been hesitant about listening to his mother's commands, especially by age 40. Yet he still gives in and submits to her. Norman's mother lays into him, poking that if Norman really was a man, he would have moved out already, had a career and a marriage. But at the same time, Norma wouldn't let him, and Norman felt compelled to take care of her, even with her plaguing his conscience with insults and backlash for being a lesser man. Norman despised how his current relationship was with his mother. Even at the age of 40, Norma still treated Norman as if he were a little boy and referred to him with childish names and talk. Norman's interests with reading about things like psychology and esoteric subjects meant nothing to his mother, who shamed him for caring about reading and filling his head with knowledge when he didn't do anything to put it into practice, and instead acted like a boy who obeyed his mother. Norma was a frail old woman by now, and it was by no means required for Norman to constantly obey her. He could have defied her, and in many cases he wanted to, but ultimately he wouldn't do that. He would always be obedient to Norma in the end. When Norman leaves his house for the motel after being scolded by his mother, he sees that he just found a new guest. Mary Crane is a secretary at an office job in Arizona in her mid-20s. After the death of her mother, she worked to provide for Lila, Mary's younger sister, while she went off to school. When Lila had come back from school, Lila found a job in a record store and insisted that Mary take a vacation for all the work she had done to provide for her family in trying times. It was on a cruise in the Caribbean that Mary had fallen in love with a certain Sam Loomis, which for fans of horror might bring to memory the psychiatrist from the Halloween franchise, which was named after this character from Psycho, due to Psycho's major influence over the horror genre. Mary and Sam immediately hit it off, but Sam is somewhat skeptical of bringing Mary into his life, and he's certainly skeptical of marriage. Sam lives in Fairvale, California, and works at a hardware store, and inherited a bunch of debt from his late father, which he gradually must pay off in the coming years. Since Sam has been sleeping in the back of a hardware store to save money, he finds the idea of marriage absurd at a time like this. Despite all of that, though, Sam still loves Mary and wants to marry her at the proper time when he can actually settle down. Mary sees Sam as her future and wants him to embody the idea of a better life that Mary has been longing for so long. Once Mary was finished with her vacation, her life went back to its simple mundanity, and her relationship with Sam was reduced to nothing but writing letters and the rare visit. Mary is quite dissatisfied with her job. Most of the people around her are snobby and rich, and have plenty of money to waste. Mary recalls a time when a man placed a $100 bill on her desk, just to make a somewhat suggestive offer to go off somewhere with him. She never agreed to it, and the man never made any inquiries about it after. and yet he had the kind of money to throw around like that. One day, a different opportunity arose when a man named Tom Cassidy, a big operator who was among the rich snobs, spoke to Mr. Lowry, Mary's boss, about giving his daughter a wedding gift of $40,000. To Thomas Cassidy, $40,000 was pocket change. Mary was rotting away with her boring, uneventful life, while all her superiors threw around cash like candy. So, when ultimately Mr. Lowry entrusts Mary with the money under the instructions that she was to deposit it on behalf of Mr. Lowry, Mary had a novel idea. She thought she would run away with the money instead and hightail it up to Fairvale in order to help Sam pay off his debts and be financially stable enough for marriage. There was plenty of problems with the idea. Obviously, she would be committing a hefty crime, and her family life with Lila would grow complicated. Mary would have to make up lies for Sam to cover up how she got hold of the money, too. She also had the problem of getting to Fairvale itself to contend with, which was not only a long drive, but also required Mary to trade in her car for a less suspicious one to keep people off her track. Ultimately, Mary went through with the idea. She drove out later that same day after being entrusted with the $40,000, and she headed to Fairvale. The whole car ride she thought about how everything would have to work now due to her new unlawful decision-making. Along the way to Fairvale, she traded in her car twice to cover her tracks. First, she traded her sedan for a coupe, and then later traded the coupe for a beater car with a crumpled front fender. After 18 hours of non-stop driving, Mary found herself very tired, and struggling to keep her eyes open as night came down. Mary was much closer to Fairvale now, but she couldn't trust herself to drive as sleep-deprived as she was. She needed sleep. Soon she passed by an unlit motel sign. Mary assumed that maybe the proprietor had just forgotten to turn it on, and soon she parked outside the motel. It's at this time that Mary meets Norman Bates. Norman apologizes for the motel's light not being on, and he mentions that he's been with his mother in their house behind the motel because she isn't feeling well. When Mary checks into the motel, she writes down the fake name of Jane Wilson from San Antonio. Norman fetches Mary's bags, but Mary makes the decision to leave the $40,000 in the car's glove box, where she thought it would be safest. It becomes apparent to the reader that Norman takes a liking to Mary, but he comes off as awkward and nervous. When Mary asks Norman where a spot would be to get food, Norman answers that there's a diner about 18 miles away, and he insists that Mary come over to his house instead and eat sandwiches. Mary agrees, and the both of them set off uphill to the Bates house to have food. Upon Mary entering the house, she sees just how old the furniture and aesthetic of the house is, as if it was a portal to another time period that was long gone by the 1950s. Mary starts to eat and makes small talk with Norman. She asks him about his family and if anyone else lives with him or if he ever married. Norman relays that he's always lived in the house with his mother, whom he felt obligated to take care of, and that he's never married. He even comments that he's never really sat down at a table with a girl the way the both of them were. Mary finds Norman to be peculiar, but she grows comfortable, as Norman was a rather pathetic man, and portrayed himself awkwardly and boyish. Mary asks Norman if she could light a cigarette, and she does. Mary feels 7 feet tall next to Norman, who had the air of a small boy despite being 40. She had offered Norman a cigarette, but Norman refused, saying that his mother wouldn't like it. He tells Mary that he would have offered her a drink, but he claims that his mother wouldn't want him keeping drinks in the house. When Mary asks Norman about his hobbies, he looks at the lifelike squirrel figure on the wall. Norman's hobby was taxidermy. Mary asks Norman if he likes to go hunting, but Norman claims that the squirrel wasn't shot by him, but by a local hunter who gave the squirrel to Norman. Norman wasn't allowed to hunt because his mother doesn't want him handling firearms. Mary sees Norman as weak and subservient, and she tells him that he should leave his current life behind and go out and do something with his life. Norman insists that he can't leave his mother behind, because if he did, then who would be there for her? When Mary tries to imply that he could put her away in a hospital, Norman claims that she isn't crazy. Norman is frustrated that this woman would suggest such a thing within his own house, as if she had the right to say something like that. How is she able to say that someone should be put away? I think we all go a little crazy sometimes, Norman said, defending his mother. It was what Norman just said then that made Mary lose her feeling of being 7 feet tall. It was true that people do go crazy at times, and maybe that was what Mary was right now. After having stole $40,000 from her own job just to run away with a man who has no clue how she acquired the money, Mary told Norman that she was growing quite tired and should go to bed, and after Norman insists that she should stay longer, he lets her go off to her room. While Mary is in her room, she contemplates all that she has done so far, and the comment that Norman made about everyone going crazy at times made Mary feel secure in thinking that maybe she made a big mistake, but she still had plenty of room to fix it. Mary could be in town just when Mr. Lowry expected her, and she could deposit the money as if nothing ever happened. Sure, she still had the issue of the car, but if she turned back now, she would have a lot less problems than if she continued her fantasy. Ultimately, Mary decided that she would turn back in the morning after she got some sleep. Meanwhile, Norman was still upset with how Mary had the audacity to suggest that Norman should put away his mother in a hospital. Norman grew to despise Mary within that short time. Although Norman's mother didn't allow him to drink, Norman still kept some alcohol in the house. He decided that he would have a drink or two to calm his mind. Norman knew he liked the girl, She was pretty, young, and intelligent, exactly the type of girl Norman wanted. And yet, Mary felt nothing but pity for Norman, and she had dared to insult his mother. Norman kept drinking, and soon he found himself looking through a hidden peephole that showed the interior of the closest room to the motel's office, the room that Mary was staying in. Mary was going to take a shower before she went to bed, and Norman watched as she took off her clothes before entering the shower. Norman knew he shouldn't watch, but he did, and then Mary was standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, checking herself out. Norman watched as Mary made different poses in front of the mirror. It was almost as if Mary knew that Norman was watching her. It was as if Mary was taunting Norman, tempting Norman's wicked desires. It was within that time that Norman blacked out. As Mary was showering, she saw a figure emerge behind the shower curtains. Soon the curtains were open, and the last thing that Mary saw was the appearance of an old woman carrying a butcher's knife. Soon after, Norman wakes up with his head aching. He looks through the peephole once again and sees that the floor of the room's bathroom is covered in pinkish water. Norman enters the room to see what had happened, and sees Mary's headless corpse in the bathroom. He immediately knew that his mother had came to protect him from that evil woman, who was acting so perversely. Norman now had to clean up the mess. He put Mary's body in her own car's trunk, and he drove it down to the nearby swamp, where he watched it sink with the dead body. He then cleaned up Mary's room, and made sure to leave no trace of her or the incident. He found one of Mary's earrings, and hoped that the other one was still being worn by Mary's corpse. Sam Loomis, Mary's boyfriend, was in his hardware store not far from the Bates Motel when a woman knocked on the store's doors. It was Lila, Mary Crane's younger sister, who had suspected that Mary was currently with Sam Loomis, and she wished to talk to her. Sam denied Mary being there with him, confused, and he learns that Mary has been missing for over a week. Just at that same moment, as Lila and Sam are talking, another man walks in, revealing himself to be Mr. Arbogast, a private investigator for Mary's company, who was hired to find the $40,000 that had gone missing and was last seen with Mary Crane. Mr. Arbogast questions the both of them, neither of them aware that Mary had made off with such a large sum of money. After realizing that Sam and Lila really don't know where Mary has been, he says that he's going to go looking around Fairvale and the towns that are close by to see if anyone has seen Mary or knows anything about her. Mr. Arbogast tells Sam and Lila that he will phone them if he gets any new information. The next day, Mr. Arbogast starts snooping around town in search for clues. Sam and Lila have to wait patiently for Mr. Arbogast to record his findings, but both of them are very anxious. Late in the day, Mr. Arbogast calls Sam and tells him that so far he has had no luck, but he still has one more place to check out, a motel off the old highway. Sam and Lila agree to wait longer for Mr. Arbogast to search the motel. Once Mr. Arbogast arrives at the motel, he meets Norman Bates. Mr. Arbogast questions Norman about having a certain Mary Crane, which Norman denies ever having checked into the motel. Mr. Arbogast looks over the motel's register and sees the name Jane Wilson, and after Arbogast compares the handwriting to an envelope with Mary's handwriting from back home, he realizes that the handwriting is identical. After Mr. Arbogast questions Norman about Jane Wilson, Norman confesses that Jane did happen to look quite like the girl that Mr. Arbogast described. Norman said that they even ate sandwiches together, and that Mary had mentioned something about going to Chicago. Mr. Arbogast finds Norman to be nervous and awkward, and sees the outline of an elderly woman in the upstairs window of the Bates house behind the motel. Mr. Arbogast asks who that woman in his house is, and Norman tells him that it's his mother. Mr. Arbogast insists on talking to her, and Norman, after hesitating, agrees to let him see her. But first Norman wants to go and tell her that Mr. Arbogast is coming. While Mr. Arbogast is waiting for Norman's return, he makes a phone call to Sam, telling him that he's going to talk to Norman's mother. Eventually, after Norman doesn't show back up at the motel, Arbogast grows impatient and makes his way to the house. He starts knocking and hears the shouts from within, from a feminine voice saying that she was coming down. As soon as the door was open, a womanly figure made a quick movement with her hand, and soon enough Mr. Arbogast was dead on the floor. He had been killed with a razor. The next day, Mr. Arbogast is nowhere in sight and has made no new phone calls to Lila or Sam. At this point, they've grown too impatient and head off for the local authorities. They get in contact with Sheriff Chambers, who gives some backstory on Norman and his mother. Shortly after Norman was born, Norman's father had deserted him and his mother. This made life quite hard for the two of them, but they still managed. Eventually, Norma met a man named Joe Constantine, and although Norma had very little trust in men after she had been deserted, she came to fall in love with Joe, and encouraged her to build the motel the way it is now. One day, Norman stumbled upon the bodies of his mother and her lover. Both of them had poisoned themselves. Norman could hardly recover after the incident, and spent a lot of time in the hospital. After he got out, he ran the motel by himself. Norman's mother was dead, She had been dead for a long time. Ultimately, Sheriff Chambers ends up at the motel to ask Norman questions, but there's nothing new. The sheriff insisted to Sam and Lila that there was a real possibility that Mary was off to Chicago. Obviously, there was no reason at all for Mary to go to Chicago, but aside from that, the trail ran cold. Lila, particularly, was displeased, and told Sam that she was going to go to the motel for herself. Eventually, Sam also agreed to go along. Once they got there, they both pretended to be husband and wife. They book a room, and insist on having cabin 1, the same that Mary had been in. Sam and Lila search the room, and it is within the bathroom that Lila finds Mary's other earring, and it happens to have some dried blood on it. During all of this, Norman is looking through the peephole. Lila told Sam that she was gonna go and get the sheriff, since they have better evidence, while Sam kept Norman occupied. Lila lied to Sam though, and she wasn't going to get the sheriff at all. She was so sick of waiting. She was going to go search the Bates house. While Sam kept Norman occupied in his office, Norman was drinking. Norman even handed Sam a shot glass too. They made small talk, increasingly growing more tension. Eventually, after an array of awkward questions, Norman calmly confesses that he knows about Lila finding the earring and about the plan she devised. As Norman sat by the window in his office, he even saw the car that Lila took off with stop. Norman knew that Lila was going to go explore the house, and when Sam tries to get past Norman, he hits Sam with a bottle of liquor he was drinking. While Lila was in the Bates house, she noticed just how old the furniture and interior was, just as her sister Mary Crane had noticed when she first entered the house. Lila goes upstairs to try and find the room that supposedly held Norman's mother, but upon reaching the room, she was nowhere in sight. The room was extremely clean and well taken care of, but had a musty smell. Lila explores the rest of the house when she makes her way to the basement. By the time Lila had made her way to the basement, she could vaguely make out the sounds of footsteps above her. There was somebody in the house. She needed to hide, and she decided the best place to go would be under the staircase itself, and she could cover herself up with something. She took an Indian blanket off the wall and it revealed a hidden fruit cellar. That's when she saw Norma, an old frail corpse. "Miss Bates," Lila gasped. She heard a yes in response, but it wasn't from the corpse. It was from the basement stairs. On those stairs stood Norman Bates, with a painted, feminine face, a white wig, and an old dress that didn't fit him. He wore red lipstick, and spoke in a high and shrill voice. "I am Norma Bates." Then Norman began rapidly running down the stairs holding a butcher's knife. Right when Sam appeared and twisted the knife out of his hand, Norman was no longer dangerous. Soon afterwards, Norman was arrested. The police found the bodies of Mary Crane and Mr. Arbogast as well as their cars in a nearby swamp. The $40,000 was still untouched in the glove box of Mary's car. Norman was placed in a psychiatric hospital and underwent many observations. Eventually, a psychiatrist reveals that Norman Bates has been living with multiple personalities, specifically with 3 facets. The boyish, immature Norman Bates as he lived all his life, subservient to the commands and wishes of his mother. Then there was the adult Norman Bates, who was responsible for hiding the other personalities. And finally, there was the personality of Norma herself, who embodied Norman after he killed her. The story was that Norma had poisoned herself alongside her lover, Joe Constantine. This wasn't really the case, however. Norman, after having walked in on Joe and Norma in bed, grew to hate the both of them. He had already disliked Joe, but when his mother started neglecting Norman and giving her attention to Joe, Norman grew violent. He poisoned the both of them with strychnine, a rat poison, and the both of them suffered horrible deaths. Norman had staged the whole thing as if they did it to themselves. After Norman had done that, he felt terrible over it and deeply missed his mother, now that he was truly alone. His mother began to form as a personality within Norman's head, and he would listen to her ever since. Whenever serious things occurred, it was Norma's personality that took over, in order to protect Norman Bates. There was times when Norman was younger when he felt sexually repressed. Times like when his mother caught Norman looking at himself in the mirror naked, and scolded him for it. The psychiatrist alludes that Norman could have been a secret transvestite when he was younger, identifying more with the gender of his mother than himself. His mother was the dominant and power-wielding personality over Norman, just like she had been when she was alive. When Norman sought protection, it was the personality of Norma that would face his fears. When Mary had made those suggestive poses in the mirror, it was Norma who protected her son against the evil woman. When that investigator went mucking about his motel, it was Norma that made him quiet again. Now that it was all said and done, all that was left was Norma. She sat there in her room under observation, condemned to live in the body of her own son, Norman Bates. Of course it was Norman who had killed those people. After all, it was Norman that had killed her. She was innocent. A fly landed on Norman's hand. She could kill it if she wanted to, but she didn't. Let those people out there see how innocent I am, she thought. She wouldn't even hurt a fly. Norman Bates serves as an icon for the horror genre, inspiring many of the cliches that would come after Psycho's publication in 1959, but more revolutionary was the movie that came in 1960. I had personally watched Psycho a long time ago and was always interested in it. I even watched the movie's lesser-known sequels, which aren't very good. Robert Bloch had written sequels to his book, but from what I know they aren't related to the movie sequels and likely aren't very good. After finishing the book, I rewatched Psycho and saw the similarities and differences between the two. They both follow the same structure for the most part, but there are some differences, like Mary being named Marianne, and how Anthony Perkins, the actor who plays Norman in the film, isn't quite overweight as Norman is described in the book. I enjoyed the book a lot, and I highly recommend it to fans of the film and people who like horror books. If you have watched until this point, I'd greatly appreciate if you would like and subscribe. This is a relatively new channel, and I try to post regularly about books that I read of all genres. Thank you for watching.